Assembly example from exam 2013. So in this question they asked for an external principal view with a partial section at the top to show the ball bearings, a full section left view with a section through the center of the wheel, a partial top view showing the mounting dimensions. They also say complete the item list for the assembly and add the relevant dimensions. Some standard components are not shown. You do not need to show all the ball bearings. Okay, so what you receive also in this exam is a schematic view of how the layout will look. So you'll have these three views that they ask for: an external principal view with partial section at the top to show the ball bearings, a full section left view with the section through the center of the wheel, so that's how they indicate where the section needs to be, and a partial top view showing the mounting dimensions. So these are the three views that we need to draw for this question. So we'll use the schematic throughout, and I'll show you how we do that. But let's look at the components that we have. So components that we have is the following. We look at the components given to you on the question, but it's important before we start to see how they combine together to identify which components belong to which components. Remember, they're always given in orthographic pairs, so either a single view, two views, or three views are given for you to see and have an idea about how these components look. So if we look at this, we can say that these two components are paired up, and they are paired up because we can see orthographically they all line up, and there's nothing to this side that lines up with them. So we have one component here. We have a second component here. And so you continue to make sure that you know how many components you have. Okay, this is just the ball bearing on its own. And then this piece gives you an indication of how this shaft pin component looks. So it actually gives you a side view, a top and a bottom view, and it actually gives you an isometric to show you the detail of how that pin looks. Okay, so now that I know and I have identified my different components, the second thing I can do at this stage is to say, are there standard components that I can identify that will be part of this assembly only by the components that I have? Now, remember, there's a couple of things that we look for, and in this case, if we look at this pin, we see that they have lubrication holes coming from the top of the pin, which immediately gives you an indication that there will have to be a grease nipple as part of this assembly. On this side, I have threading, M16, so it might mean that I have a bolt on this side, but that's not necessarily clear at this stage, but that can be part of the picture. But definitely I will have a grease nipple that will allow for grease to be put into this and run out through this component. Also, when I have a component where there's a pin and a grease nipple, the component that I know is associated with that is also a bushing. So most likely, just because I understand my standard components, it means that I have a bush that runs over this part of the component, and around the bush we will have a wheel. So these are things that we can immediately say without even looking at the sizes and the dimensions of these components, that they will probably be connected because of how we understand standard components. If this is not clear to you, I would strongly suggest that you go through the tutorial about standard components again to make sure that you understand what each of these components needs. Okay, so then we can start at any place in the assembly. We can start with any component. But before we start, we want to at least have an idea of how they fit together. Now, that is what the schematic is for. The schematic gives you an idea of how the components are fitting together. In this principal view, you can see there's this outside housing and this wheel. And so if you look at, for example, this component, it's exactly the same as this. So we know that this is most likely the same component. And then we have a wheel component that we see over here. We have the wheel. So we can already identify that these two will line up through this hole. And at the top, we see there's a specific feature. But remember, this is also just a schematic. So this can be misleading. But in this case, that will indicate something else to us. But we'll continue and see what that means later on. Okay, so I know that there's a wheel and this housing, and the section line is running through that. Now remember, if I look at the mark allocation for a drawing like this, the largest portion of the marks will lie in the section drawing. So it's advisable to start first with the section drawing. And I know the section line is running through the center of the wheel. Okay, so what do I know about the wheel? From my standard components, I know that inside the wheel, I will have a bush and the pin. So already I have an indication of what I can start with and where I can start to draw. So here I can definitely start by drawing this pin with the bush, with the wheel. But we want to double check that that actually makes sense according to our dimensions. So when we look at the dimensions for each of these parts, we see that the inner part of the wheel is 22. And that is the same as the outer part for the bush. That's also 22. The inner part of the bush is 16, and the outer part of this component is 16. So we see that that does make sense. The bush will fit onto this component and into the wheel. Those three components are definitely linked. In terms of length, how long and how will they fit into each other? The wheel here, they give me as 86, and it's the same as the bush, 86. So it will be an exact match between these two. But how these two match onto the pin, if I push them all the way against this part, it means that there's 86 there. But I'm not sure where on this it will actually fit. I know the bush needs to be somewhere over this grease lubrication hole. So it will be somewhere over that, but I'm not sure where it will fit in general. How will I know? This is where I use my schematic. Remember, on our schematic we can see that we have the housing on the outside, which means that the wheel and the bush and the pin is on the inside, and around this wheel I have this housing, which means that I'll have my wheel on my bush around the pin, but between the pin head and the edge of the pin, I will have this housing that goes around this wheel. Okay, and the housing I've identified as this component. So here I can see this part. If the pin goes through on both ends, I can have the housing on the one side of the wheel and on the other side. Is there enough space for the wheel? Yes. There's 88 here. I know the wheel is 86, which means there'll be a small gap on either side, so that it will be able to fit. Now, how does this pin fit into this housing? Does it matter? In our case, because we have a very special pin with a square head at the top, it does matter. And if you look at the drawing that I have here, is you can see that here I have there's a square hole here and a round hole, which means that there's a specific side from where I want this pin to be filled in. Okay. I'm also making a left section view. So if I'm cutting through this and I'm looking from the left, that would mean that this pin will be put in from the opposite side. So it's not going to be orientated in this direction, but it's actually going to be turned around in order for this square part to be put on this side when I'm drawing it from the left. Okay, so let's start by drawing this now that we have an understanding of how they will fit together. So, if we start with the pin, it's easy because we know what's going to go around the pin. And we can turn the pin around so we know how it looks and we don't have to struggle to draw it the opposite way around. So we literally redraw the pin exactly as we see it on the question. So we have this long pin with this end, head on the end. This end section has some threading. And then I also have all this information for the grease nipple. Okay, with these long lubrication holes. Okay, and the sectioning, because something interesting is happening on the inside of this pin, otherwise it wouldn't have been sectioned. So we can do it exactly as we see it on the drawing, and we can already add in our center lines. Okay, now at this stage you can already draw in the grease nipple. Because you know the grease nipple will sit on here, you might as well get that out of the way. Add the grease nipple on here. And remember, when you add a grease nipple at the top, it's screwing into this hole. So there's some place where this grease nipple finishes. It's important that you remember that. Okay, so there's a place where the grease nipple ends and there's a place where the threading ends. It's the same as your bolt assembly. So if this is unclear to you, please go look at how that works again in your tutorial about standard components. But then we've already added the grease nipple and we know we're sorted with that. Now we know that we have the bush that fits around this pin and we have the wheel. But before we even have that, we have the housing, right? So the first thing that I will have at the edge here will be the housing part. Now, I don't have to draw the full housing in yet, but what I definitely need is I need this distance to be able to gauge where my wheel and my bush will sit. So if I look at this housing and I look at the distance of this side, I see that that is 6. Okay, so remember you want to be proportional, and the top part, so this head is also 6, which means that this part will also be 6. Are these diameters exactly the same? So remember there's a 16 here, and yes, it's also a 16 here, which means that they fit exactly on top of each other. So that means my housing will look something like this. I don't need to finish them at this stage. I can just put them in now to finish in the inside and then see how the rest looks. But at this stage you can already say, I know how it will look because I'm sectioning through here. Remember, I'm sectioning through the middle of this component. So at the bottom part, there'll be a short bit.